Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth. I'm your host, Trudy Stern. Today, we're thrilled to welcome back Jonathan Shanzer, Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan is a renowned expert on Middle Eastern politics and terrorism, frequently appearing on CNN, Fox, and I-24. He's the author of several influential books, including State of Failure and The Forever War. Jonathan has been one of our most insightful guests, offering unparalleled analysis on Middle Eastern affairs, counterterrorism, and the U.S. foreign policy. Since his last visit, the world has not slowed down, and neither has he. We're eager to hear his thoughts on the latest developments and what they mean for all of us. Jonathan, welcome back. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks, Trudy. Great to be with you.
So first of all, let's go right to New Orleans and Las Vegas. Can you tell us what you know about these terrorist attacks? What your thoughts are?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think so far it's still pretty murky. We don't know everything here. It does appear to be motivated by the Islamic State. We have state and local officials trying to pretend that this is not Islamist terrorism, which is, of course, a problem in and of itself, because there's no way we're going to get past any of this, or at least address the underlying challenges, without being honest about who has perpetrated these attacks. There are some reports right now suggesting that the two attackers may have known each other. They may have served in the U.S. military together. We're still looking into that. But the details are still sketchy. I think the bottom line for me is that we are seeing a resurgence of Sunni jihadism. In other words, what we've been watching for the last 14 months, this war that Israel's been waging overseas, and that U.S. servicemen have been trying to fend off. This has been Shiite-dominated radicalism and violence, right? Sponsored by the Islamic Republic of Iran primarily, but also the Houthis and Hezbollah. These are Shiite fighters. Some of these militias that we've been watching out of Iraq and Syria, also Shiite, the minority sect within Islam. Right now, what we're watching is a resurgence of Sunni jihadism. And what's interesting about this, the Sunni jihadism or Sunni Islam represents 80% or so of the Muslim world, so it's the vast majority. But what's really interesting is that it's happening alongside the conquest of Syria on the part of Al-Qaeda. So you get a sense that after the last 14 months of Iran flexing its muscles on the world stage with all of its proxies and its threats, now you're watching suddenly the Iranian axis is beginning to unravel. They're weakening after Israel has taken it to a lot of Iran's proxies and to Iran itself. And all of a sudden, we're watching this surge of activity on the part of the Sunni jihadist factions, and that's one to watch.
So it seems like we were all focused so much on Iran, and and trying to limit its power, while this other side was really building up, and this other side has a deep seat hatred for America also, as does Iran. But this was 9/11, and now, in the past 4 years, they've been able to come right across our border and have cells all over our country that we don't even know about. How dangerous is this a time for us in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to say that it's not as if we shouldn't have had our eye on Iran. We needed to, we still need to, because of course Iran still may make a dash for a nuclear weapon. And they still have the capacity of attacking the United States and our allies across the Middle East. So we need to continue to be vigilant there. But yeah, I think maybe we fell asleep at the switch a little bit here as it relates to the Sunni jihadi threat. And I think actually you can date that back to really even maybe the Obama era, the end of the Obama era. I mean, I remember at the time the former president calling ISIS the JV team, and calling Al-Qaeda, the major threat. Of course, we then saw ISIS really begin to take off. The Islamic State began to pose a much greater threat across the region. They were defeated in large part by the Trump policy, right? I mean, we saw the defeat of the Islamic State. But I think what people tend to forget is that these radicals have never left. I mean, in other words, you can defeat an organized terror group, but the ideology persists. And this is an ideology that we have been fighting, that the United States and our allies have been fighting since 9/11, if not well before that. This is going to be a persistent challenge. We cannot ignore the fact that Sunni jihadism exists. Al Qaeda is still uh, uh, rather popular. I don't want to say that it's the majority of Muslims because that's absolutely not the case. But even if it's 10 or 20% of the Muslim world that supports this ideology, that's massive. The numbers, I think we need to put this into context here. When we talk about the 1.5 or maybe even 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, so you take 20% of that, that's the population of the United States of America. And that is just a large number of people that we're going to have to contend with who embrace this ideology in some way or another. It could be, by the way, much smaller, and that would be great news. But I think 20%, give or take, maybe what we're dealing with. And so we shouldn't be surprised to find that there are adherents to this ideology in the United States and anywhere else around the world.
So it seems though that they fight very differently. One has organized armies, and the other one is these terror cells that perpetrate terror attacks on people using car bombs and suicide bombs, and just a very different type of terror. And I think in some ways very hard to fight, very hard to locate, very hard to fight. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And this has always been the challenge with these Sunni jihadi groups. I mean, when they take the form of, the Nusra Front or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group that just took over Syria, they're a little bit easier to kind of zero in on and to potentially fight. The Islamic State, when it tried to create institutions and to create an army, it became easier to defeat. But when they operate in the shadows, as you suggest, when they operate in small cells, when they carry out attacks where they're really trying to evade the detection of Western intelligence, this is when you see attacks like what we just saw in Las Vegas and New Orleans. And those are very difficult to prevent. And this is sort of a back to the future moment for us because we were seeing things like this in the aftermath of 9/11, the aftermath of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, where Al Qaeda and what we call its affiliate groups, these smaller offshoots, that adhere to the ideology of Al Qaeda but are not integrated in any formal way in some kind of army or government. They're operating independently, and what's really interesting to me is that they seem to be motivated anew. And what's motivating them right now is I think what the big question is. I mean, we used to look at people like Osama bin Laden or his deputy Ayman al-Zawahiri, and they were out there giving speeches and exhorting people to go out and carry out these attacks. Al Qaeda's leadership is largely unknown. We don't follow these leaders the way that we used to. They're not as prominent. They're not as public. And so, what is motivating these, or who is motivating these individuals to carry out attacks by way of cell? That's the question that I think we're going to need to try to answer in the coming days and weeks.
Seems like a very hard fight to fight. Very difficult to identify these, identify where these cells are, identify what their next moves are. And now with 4 years of open borders, I'm not optimistic. How about you?
Well, look, when I worked for the U.S. Treasury, I was consuming intelligence and I was watching the kinds of threats that appeared on a regular basis in the United States. To some extent, I'd say we got a little lucky here and there. You may recall the Times Square bombing that the Pakistani Taliban tried to carry out some 2 decades ago, and it was a botched bombing, and we got very lucky. But then there's plenty of other intelligence work carried out by dedicated professionals here in this country where they're stopping attacks and they're arresting people. I mean, there was an individual who was planning attacks against AIPAC in Florida over the new year, and he was thwarted. Right, that the intelligence community here in this country, we were able to track him down and stop him. So I'd say it's being a combination of lucky and good, and this is what we're going to have to rely upon. But it is daunting if we're watching the resurgence of this cell activity. It's going to be a challenge. It always is. It's asymmetric. I think we do generally better when we're dealing with like identified structures that we can penetrate through intelligence gathering. It's a lot harder to do that when these groups operate in small cells.
Yeah, it seems like we're very reactive as opposed to proactive. Now I see a lot going, a lot of information being given about how they could have prevented the New Orleans attack by, having roadblocks. They allowed in a vehicle, like a truck with an ISIS flag flying. It just seems, ridiculous. And now we've got to get proactive.
We do, and again, part of that has to do with a recognition of the threat. And when you look at, municipal and local and state governments, I think you still have folks, and by the way, you have it at the federal government level too, a reluctance to acknowledge the threat, the ideological threat posed by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Iran, etc. This idea that we don't want to talk about Islam as being part of the problem. I think what people need to remember here is that, we're not pointing a finger at the entire religion of Islam and saying that, all 1.5 or 1.8 billion Muslims in the world are a problem. We're looking at a small minority, but it is going to be important to, to identify that ideology as a key driver. And you can't ignore things like an Islamic State flag. You just can't do that. You need to understand that identifying that as a potential tip-off of intent is not Islamophobic. It is just realism. And I think authorities are still wrestling with that. It's amazing. I mean, we were wrestling with this more than 20 years ago after the 9/11 attacks, sort of trying to figure out where that happy medium would be of being able to identify markers of ideological intent versus impugning an entire community or an entire religion. We're still struggling to get that right, and it's maddening. It really is.
Great points, actually, really great analysis. I mean, even harder now that we have these marches through our cities with pro-Hamas flags and people with keffiyehs wrapped around their face, shouting, all sorts of anti-American, anti-Israel slogans. But I guess we'll just have to become even more vigilant. I'd like to turn now, actually, to a different thing going on in our country right now. President Carter has died over the weekend, and I know that you have a lot of feelings about President Carter's presidency. You wrote about that, and you spoke about that. Could you share that with us?
Sure. I mean, I went to Emory University in Atlanta, and I recall he used to hold these town hall meetings at the beginning of every school year, and I remember, feeling really compelled to attend them, to hear the wisdom of, a former president of the United States. I mean, I was young when he was president. I mean, I was under 10 when he first took office, and so I don't have a lot of clear political memories of what he did or didn't do. I think he had sort of a checkered history, if you will. I mean, it was during his time in office that we saw the Iran hostage crisis, and he was unable to solve that. And one could argue that he failed in that regard. But then again, he did broker the Camp David Accords, Israel's first major peace agreement with an Arab country, and that was a success. But I think for me, apart from that record of, some good and bad, which I think every president has, it's Carter's post-presidency that has really troubled me the most. And by that, I mean, what we've seen is that Carter, over the last several decades, has been absolutely toxic as it relates to Israel. He wrote actually two books on the conflict. One was called "Yes, We Can Have Peace in the Holy Land," and that was, I suppose, a more moderate version of the book that he went on to publish after that, where it was called Palestine Peace, Not Apartheid. And he used the word apartheid. That is significant. That was actually probably, he was the most senior person to use that word, which is libelous in my view. Israel, as we know, has integrated its Arab-Israeli minority, and we've got Arabs that serve in the Knesset and as Supreme Court justices and doctors. And I think Carter did a disservice to everyone in the region by using the A word, as we would call it. There was a moment in 2006 where my former professor at Emory, Ken Stein, who had been running the Carter Center, had a full rupture with Jimmy Carter, where he left the Carter Center and basically said that Carter had lost his marbles, that he had gone off the deep end as it relates to his criticism of Israel. And I think Ken is an incredibly principled man. And when he came out and took Carter to task for this, I was proud of him for doing so. But I would say that really the last, almost 20 years, we have seen a radicalization of the former president. He really was toxic as it related to Israel, always critical of the Israelis, never critical of, I mean, he met with Hamas. He met with some of Israel's worst haters and he legitimized them. So I think Carter did a lot of damage in the last couple of decades of his life. I'll just tell you anecdotally and personally, every year I would get calls from Emory saying, will you give to the annual campaign? And I said, is Carter still on your staff? And they said, yes. And I said, well, you won't get a penny, not from me. And we'll see now where the school goes in terms of its post-Carter policies. But Jimmy Carter was a dangerous post-president, a mediocre president when he was in office, but very dangerous after he got out as it relates to the Middle East.
He also met with Kim Jong-un, his father, right? And was responsible for some damage in that regard as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a man who, after a time really felt like he, could meet anyone. He was kind of this no labels approach to, his post-presidency. But I think he bestowed legitimacy upon a number of actors that he never should have. There were things that he did, by the way. I mean, working with Habitat for Humanity, promoting democracy through the Carter Center. These were the things that he should have stuck to. I think had he done that, I think we all would have celebrated him as maybe a flawed president, but an honest man. But I do think that he really he allowed himself, or he inserted himself into things where he just did not have the depth, he didn't have the nuance, he didn't have the understanding. And I think people conflated his former position and the respect that that deserves with legitimacy in terms of his ideas. And that I think was it was just his undoing. I always say that the Arab-Israeli conflict brings out the worst in people. It really often does. And Jimmy Carter was truly a case in point.
Do you think he was an anti-Semite? Was that what was driving his passion in that regard?
I know people who say that he was. I know people who say that he wasn't. I'm not there to judge. I obviously I never met him. I didn't sit with him and and talk to him about his ideas. I shook his hand once in after one of those lectures at Emory. So I really don't know what motivates a man to engage in this kind of rhetoric and this kind of activity. But I will say that he had an obsession with the Jewish state. And obsessions are, not necessarily healthy, not when you're trying to be an analytical professional, and especially a former president, you'd expect more.
Yes, you absolutely would expect more from that. Can we turn now for a moment to the Middle East? It seems so much is going on here in the country. We could talk for hours about that, but I do want to get to the Middle East. So the Houthis are continuing to disrupt and to bomb, send missiles to Israel daily, nightly. I think they're in the bomb shelters. Hezbollah was degraded tremendously. Hamas was degraded tremendously. These were very sophisticated armies. The Houthis, they're like a ragtag group. Even Iran was degraded significantly. How is it that they are last man standing here and they're able to do so much damage? And it doesn't seem like, this is able to be addressed. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that we're watching right now. I mean, I think when you look around that, there was a seven front war that Israel was fighting kinetically, right, across the Middle East. And so the Hamas front, Hamas is largely defeated. Hezbollah, they waved the white flag, they asked for a ceasefire. Israel's, given him that. You've got the Assad regime that's fallen, right? And so that's not an active war, at least against an Iran proxy any longer. So that's three. The Israelis also hit Iran itself, and Iran appears to be chastened, and they're no longer interested in firing missiles and drones at Israel from there. So that's four fronts that have been neutralized. You could even argue that what was happening out of Iraq is no longer, that's gone quiet. So really what you have left are two fronts where Israel, I think, is still dealing with the threat. One is the West Bank, and I think, there you're going to always see unrest. We saw it before 10/7. We're going to see it after. You've got a bunch of different groups that are against the Palestinian Authority. They're against Israel. They like to destabilize this place where there are, 450,000 Jews living there, and they'd like to destabilize this. They want to draw attention to the disputed territory of Judea and Samaria of the West Bank. And so I would expect that to continue. But the one that you point out is probably the most dangerous dynamic right now, and the most interesting too, because the Houthis continue to fire ballistic missiles. These are not rockets or drones, simple stuff. These are very large missiles that the Israelis are sustaining fire right now from the Houthis. We've never, I don't think, seen a terrorist group with ballistic missile capabilities like this, where they're able to fire, 1,200 kilometers away and hit Israeli territory. This is a new capability that Iran has provided their proxy in Yemen. And, from Israel's perspective, it's far away. And Israel doesn't have a rocket corps. They don't just fire rockets back and say, you hit us, we'll hit you. When the Israelis respond, they got to scramble jets and airplanes and refueling planes, and they've got to fly 1,200 kilometers across the Middle East and then bomb very specific targets. And so this dynamic is a challenging one for Israel right now. The Iranians are going to continue to provide these weapons. The Houthis are not deterred. The fact that Israel's destroying some of their capabilities, they don't care. They're ready to fight to the end. And so the Israelis have to figure out, how do they hold the Houthis to account? How do they deter the Houthis? But also, how do they deter the Iranian regime? How do they prevent the regime itself from continuing to provide these weapons and the training and the cash and everything that's needed in order for this proxy war to continue? A lot of people are saying right now that Israel is going to have to attack Iran itself to deter these strikes from the Houthis. Some people say that the Houthis can be bombed into submission. We'll have to wait and see, but I think right now we're beginning to watch a new dynamic unfold where the ballistic missiles are coming. The Israelis respond with some pinpoint attacks. Whether that can continue for weeks on end or months on end from Israel's perspective is an interesting question, let alone whether the Houthis can be deterred by such activity.
I think that they're buried deep in rock, deep down, where they're firing from, and very hard to get to. Is that correct?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, I mean, the Israelis took out, for example, the watchtower at the airport, the control tower at the airport there, because Iran was flying in weapon systems. So the Israelis said, okay, well, we're going to make you blind so that you're unable to, operate your airport. So there are assets that are above ground that are very, obvious that Israel can take out. Some of the weapons themselves are likely being stored underground and they may be harder to hit. It's interesting also that we are seeing U.S. strikes against some of these Houthi targets. But I think probably the most, important thing to watch right now is the potential for an international coalition to be cobbled together. Israel's advocating for this right now. It's needed because it's not just Israel that's sustaining this fire. It's, international shipping is still being blocked by the Houthis. American warships are still coming under attack by the Houthis. It was interesting. I met the commanding officer of the USS Eisenhower, a guy by the name of Captain Chris Hill, goes by the call sign Chowda. Well, he's from Boston, which is kind of hilarious. But he was saying that the amount of action that his ship has seen since this war began, it's more than any ship has seen since World War II. There is a massive amount of military activity taking place in the Red Sea, and it is targeting the US, the US-led world order, international trade, and Israel. Something needs to be done, and it cannot only be Israel responding to Houthi aggression, right? We're going to need to get a handle on this. And so there are a lot of interesting questions right now. Now that we've got a new administration coming in, Donald Trump, we all remember he was the one who put the Houthis on the terrorism list in one of the final days of his administration. The Biden administration removed that listing within one of the first days of their new administration. It's become kind of a partisan issue, the Houthis. So it'll be very interesting to see what Donald Trump does when he returns. I suspect he'll put them back on the terrorism list. That's a bureaucratic listing of sorts, right? That's about sanctions. But then comes the question afterwards. Will Trump start to order the military as commander in chief? Will he order renewed strikes that will shut down the Houthi campaign of aggression that has been terrorizing Israel and the Red Sea? This is, I think, the big question that will be answered in, let's say 3 weeks or a month from now. We'll probably start to get a sense of whether the tide is going to turn with new American leadership.
I certainly hope so. This is not just an Israel issue. This is very much a United States issue, also, as you have just pointed out. Now that uh, a lot of the fronts have been degraded in the Israeli war, one seems to have changed significantly. That's Syria, with the Assad regime gone and now Jolani taking over that country. Do you see that as being extremely dangerous for Israel? And can you just speak about that particular front?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are a couple things that I would point out right now. Look, on the one hand, it's probably a little safer from Israel's perspective that there's no longer a contiguous land bridge, as we called it, that Iran can use, stretching from its own territory through Iraq, through Syria, into Lebanon. And that would enable or facilitate the delivery of weapons, systems, and cash, and fighters, and training, and everything, all the things that Iran was doing in what we call the Shiite Crescent. And so Iran has lost Syria as a transit point for weapons to Hezbollah. They've lost it as a staging ground for attacks against Israel, as a place where weapons can be manufactured or assembled. All of those things are gone, and I think that is good news for Israel and good news for the rest of the Middle East. The problem is that the new leaders of Syria, they are Al Qaeda. I mean, let me just be very clear. They call themselves Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but in reality, it was in 2016, I believe, they changed their name from the Nusra Front to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. It was plastic surgery. It was a nose job. It was lipstick on a pig, so to speak, right? I mean, the idea is they were just trying to look more moderate. They were trying to change their outward perception. But the people that are running this new regime, led by Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, these are Al-Qaeda. These are Sunni Islamic extremists. And again, this may have inspired what we saw in places like New Orleans and Las Vegas, right? To see the resurgence of Sunni jihadism in this way. It's probably the most important military victory for Al Qaeda since getting picked apart in the war on terror by the United States over 20 something years. So they appear to have a bit more muscle now in Syria. They're saying that they're moderate, or they're saying that they're pragmatic and they don't want war with Israel. I think they want time. I think they want time to get their feet under them. They want to solidify their rule. They want to get stronger so that they could potentially at some point mount attacks. So that's one thing to watch. But the other thing that I will just point out is the concern that I have about HTS's patrons. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the new leaders of Syria, are sponsored by two countries primarily right now. Militarily, logistically, politically, they're getting a lot of guidance from Turkey. Turkey is a nasty country. A lot of people say, oh, well, they're NATO allies. Actually, they facilitated the rise of ISIS. They're sponsors of Hamas. They've helped Iran evade sanctions. They have been terrible allies to the United States, buying Russian-made military equipment that we have banned them from doing. They're bad news. The Turks need to be watched. In my view, they're kind of like the Sunni version of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If we're not careful, this could become a very dangerous, autocratic, Islamic dictatorship that supports all manner of jihadi groups. And then you got to look at the money behind this entire operation. There, we're looking at the country of Qatar, another country that is nominally identified as an American ally, but they have been sponsors of Hamas, sponsors of the Taliban, sponsors of Al Qaeda, and sponsors of ISIS. They've been financial patrons to all, providing headquarters to all. These are two countries that purport to be American allies and pragmatists or moderates, but they are extremely dangerous, up-and-coming jihadi patrons that I think we all need to keep a close eye on. So I'm very nervous about what we're going to see come out of Syria in the coming weeks and months. Right now, things appear to be calm, but I don't think that that is an indicator of what will come. I think we should expect the worst, and I do believe that Israel is preparing for that eventuality.
Okay, so that's very frightening. Just as we defeat one group, the next one rises up against us. I think that is very biblical, actually. And I don't think you can be closer to lipstick on a pig than putting Jolani in a suit. So I think that is a very good assessment. Sadly, we are out of time, and that wraps up this week's episode of Nothing But the Truth. Jonathan, you were amazing. You really shed light on so many of the issues that are facing our country and Israel right now, and helping us to navigate through them. Your understanding of world geopolitics has been just totally invaluable to today's discussion. And as we see this landscape constantly shifting, and so much more to consider, I hope that you will come back and help us through these issues again. To our audience, thank you for tuning in to Nothing But the Truth. Don't forget to join us every Thursday night at 9:30 p.m. for another compelling conversation. And if you missed any part of the show or want to revisit past episodes, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Trudy Stern, and remember, you will always get the truth here.